asking if you have any suggestions for diverse plays that explore language with the same depth as Shakespeare, specifically plays that are not from Europe or include immigrant perspectives. She loves the classics, but would like to provide as many viewpoints as possible for students.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and really kind of always relevant. Um, that I could go on for a long time, but let me name at least a few plays that I think work in the high school classroom, because there are lots of great plays. They don't always work in a high school setting. So for my money, plays that have language and really character as rich as Shakespeare, really anything by August Wilson, the great 20th century African-American playwright, really one of the greatest playwrights that America has ever produced. He's one of the few playwrights to have a theater named after him on Broadway, the August Wilson Theater. There's only a couple others. There's a Eugene O'Neill Theater, and I think maybe one other that's named after a playwright. And so the classic work by August Wilson, if you're not familiar with him, is a play called Fences. There's also a relatively recent movie starring Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington also played in Fences on Broadway, and had a long relationship with August Wilson. And so I think Wilson is just a tremendous playwright. I mean, it's not written in verse, so it's not the same kind of language as Shakespeare, but his language is incredibly rich. Really great speeches like you get in Shakespeare, and yet much closer to our own time and place than Shakespeare would be, and of course, much more diverse in that regard. Also, many of you, I'm guessing, probably know the play A Raisin in the Sun, so you don't need me to introduce you to it, but I am going to vouch for it as just really being a tremendous work of drama that does all of the things I was talking about in the presentation. They're all there in A Raisin in the Sun, and you can really kind of follow through any of those major characters and come to some really fascinating places. So I definitely recommend teaching that. There is another play I'm guessing almost none of you have heard of, because it's just not very well known at all, and that's a play called Take a Giant Step, by a playwright named Louis Peterson. And that was actually the first play by an African-American ever produced on Broadway. Raisin in the Sun was the first play by an African-American woman, but Louis Peterson's Take a Giant Step was the first play on Broadway in 1953. I don't know how much flexibility you have in terms of picking plays that probably are not on your approved lists, but if you do have that flexibility, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's so interesting and it's so relevant. It's about an African-American high school student in a majority white school district who speaks up against a teacher who's spreading lies about slavery, who's saying that slavery was not that bad. This is set in the 1950s, and then gets discipline sent to the principal's office for speaking up, and then has to face a series of choices, these decisions that I was talking about whether to back down or whether to risk getting kicked out of school and risk the education and the opportunities that he has being in this very acclaimed school district. So it's very relevant to high school students. It's very relevant to the kinds of topics that are still very much in the discourse today. It's really underappreciated as a play. I think it's really something worth exploring if you have the means of doing so. And then just because you mentioned classics here, Claire, I'm also going to mention the Caribbean playwright Derek Walcott. You might also know him as a poet. He's a very well-known poet. He has a play called The Odyssey, a stage version, which is basically the story of the Odyssey that we all know from Greek mythology, but set in the Caribbean. Derek Walcott is a native. He's from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia, of African descent. And it's set in the Caribbean with Caribbean characters, most of whom are also of African descent or Hispanic. And so it's a retelling of this kind of foundational myth of Western culture from a much more diverse perspective. And so it's really fascinating, especially if you're already teaching the Odyssey, to pair that with Derek Walcott's The Odyssey, a stage version could be a really interesting choice. So those are just a few examples, but hopefully that's useful.
So the next question is, if you were going to be teaching Shakespeare to a class of 6th or 7th graders, what would really be the biggest takeaway that you would try to get them to understand?
Oh, wow. Okay, so if you're going to understand one thing about Shakespeare. I mean, for me, I think the most important thing for them to understand about Shakespeare is that he's actually really fun. You know, the goal is to get them interested in maybe pursuing more Shakespeare, seeing, you know, watching something on TV, or going to see a Shakespeare play. And the best way to do that, I know this touches on some of the other questions as well, would be to get them up and doing Shakespeare on their feet. I absolutely endorse getting students up on their feet and doing plays. You know, push all the desks to the side if you can and get them up, and make it exciting for them, because theater is an artistry made of the human body. It's about bodies in space, doing things, and so trying to get them to kind of live out Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare can be so intimidating because of the language, and I you know, I'm going to endorse this. Not all people who teach Shakespeare would endorse this, but for purposes of getting, you know, younger students, 6th, 7th grade, interested in Shakespeare, if you can get, you know, I would say that if you can use a version that does a kind of modernized language, just to get them up on their feet and understanding that this is really cool, and like there's people in conflict and there's people in love and there's sword fights, and it's actually, you know, it's just as good as any Hollywood movie, then I think that's worth the trade-off. I do think, you know, if you have the time and space, absolutely sit down, work on the poetry with them, work on the language. But as a theater guy, more than a literature guy, I would say, you know, even if it means simplifying the language and using a simplified language version for a particular scene, get them up on their feet and doing this so that they can actually understand how fun and cool Shakespeare really is. So a semi-controversial endorsement there on my part.
I remember getting up and performing those plays when I was in college even. So we
yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's the best way to teach it even when you're in college. Just get up and do it. That's what it's made to do.
Right. So the next question is, do you have any modern diverse plays that you might pair with the classics, that you know are kind of frequently taught in the classroom?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, some of this I'll just kind of refer to what I already mentioned in the previous example. Again, Derek Walcott's Odyssey, a stage version, is such a great pairing if you're doing the Odyssey. You know, and August Wilson's Fences in particular is basically a tragedy. You could play it, you know, if you most high school classrooms probably don't do King Lear, but if you're doing kind of Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, those are kind of different kinds of tragedies. It's most similar to something like King Lear. But if you're doing a tragedy, even if you're doing Macbeth, actually, Fences is such a great pairing with that. Because in many ways, the main character in Fences is trying to do right by his family, but in the end, really kind of destroys them. His son disowns him and doesn't talk to him. He has a child by another woman that his wife actually agrees to raise, but also kind of ends their marriage as a functional marriage. He's really kind of destroyed his family in the process of trying to protect them from the society at large and from racism. It's a brilliant play, and it works very nicely against any Shakespearean tragedy, if you want to look at it as a kind of modern tragedy.
That is a great play.
Yeah.
So in terms of thinking about author's purpose, how would you really kind of have students grapple with that when oftentimes, you know, things can kind of change based on how the particular actor or director is approaching tone, and that sort of thing. So what might you recommend, any activities that you have for helping students kind of deal with how tone can change and then it kind of changes the overall meaning?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that, you know, that's really fundamental to drama, the idea that the meaning of a play can actually change significantly based on the decisions that the actors or the directors make. It's one of the things that I like about drama. I can go see the same play, you know, 10 different times in different productions and have 10 different experiences. I absolutely love it. And so I think making your students aware of that is really important. Now, I understand the TKS, I don't know how you all say it, or TEX, but the standards want you to grapple with author's purpose, and that can be really hard to pin down in a play, most of all. I mean, I think what we can get at in terms of author's purpose has to do with the kind of overall structure, the choices that they're making. Who is going to be their main character? What decisions does that character face? What choices does he make in the face of those decisions, and where does he or she end up, right? So at a play like A Doll's House, which I'll use as a classic example, Ibsen's purpose is to show how unjust sexism is in his society. That's very clear. And Ibsen is very much on Nora's side, the main character, even though she's leaving her husband and family, which was completely scandalous in Ibsen's day. That is his purpose. But actors and directors can make a whole lot of choices, and you can make Nora seem very heroic. You can make her seem very selfish if you make certain kinds of decisions, not for leaving her husband, who's basically a jerk in the play, and that's pretty clear, but for leaving her children behind. And a lot of students actually grapple with, wait, she's leaving her children in the care of this jerk. And so you can make certain kinds of decisions that make her seem less heroic, though I think Ibsen's purpose there was to make her seem very heroic for these big decisions, that she's going to go off and live her own life in a society that doesn't want women to be able to do that. One thing I do a lot in my classes that I definitely recommend is have different groups of students do the same scene and have them explicitly try to do it in different ways and say, all right, so in this scene, I want you 2 or 3 students to do this, and I want Nora to really seem like the hero in this version, and have them work on that. And then this other group of 2 or 3 students, I want you to do this 2 or 3, the same scene, and I want Nora to seem very conflicted in this scene, or I want her husband to seem like the hero. Like, do something that seems like the opposite of what the play intends. Or do, Romeo and Juliet, you do a scene, and I want Romeo and Juliet to really be in love in this one. And this one, I want Romeo and Juliet to not really know each other very well, and this is all kind of confusing. And in this one, I want Romeo to seem really kind of hasty and like he doesn't even care that much about Juliet. Just do kind of crazy things with the scene and have them all kind of perform it if you have the time for this. And then have the students react and say, well, this one didn't make a lot of sense, but this one really made me think of it differently. I love doing that if I have time in my classrooms, because I think that's what theater is. It's about kind of getting things up on their feet and experimenting with it.
So then would you recommend that the Aristotles list that you showed to us, would you recommend providing students with that list before kind of discussing the play? Or do you think it's better to kind of visit these aspects as you're discussing specific elements of a particular way? How do you kind of direct students?
That's great. I mean, I would probably recommend knowing it yourself as the teacher and then kind of building it organically into the classroom discussion and into the way that you're teaching it. I don't want it to kind of seem like a checklist that students have to kind of like check off. I think they might get the wrong idea about that. This is more kind of a tool for you as teachers to understand the kind of the different parts of a play that you need to kind of help your students think about. But I wouldn't necessarily give them the list, especially because it's not going to show up on any of these exams or standardized tests. And so it might just kind of seem confusing to them. But I think it gives us as teachers a kind of really useful way to approach drama in different ways to try to get the students to think about it. Think about, like, how does one event lead to the next? What are the different events, even in a small scene? What are the motivation behind a given line? What's the subtext? What are the decisions that the character is making? Those are, I think, great ways to help students think about a text. I wouldn't necessarily give them the full list, in my opinion there.
So then what would you say are some kind of short drama-based exercises that maybe would function as a warm-up to really help students keep their learning and ongoing, but yet still maintain interest in the subject?
Yeah, so theater is full of so many great exercises that get people kind of out of their feet. So I'm going to talk about one that I think is just really, has nothing to do with theater in particular, even though it's a theater warm-up exercise, and then another that actually has to do with teaching theater. But one that I really love doing, you have to have the right kind of class for this, but if you do, trying to get a group of people to count to 10 as a group without any 2 people saying the same number at the same time. And anytime anyone does, you have to start over. It's amazing. If you get students who are willing to try this, it's amazing how it builds attention and concentration and kind of group connection amongst one another. Because usually there's a long silence and like 2 people will blurt out the number 3 at the same time, and you have to start over. And they can't kind of give visual signals to each other. And if you finally get it, usually takes like 15 minutes, maybe not that long, but 5 or 10 minutes to really get it right, even if you're just trying to count to 10. And by the end of that, everyone is kind of very calm and very tuned into each other. The reason this is the theater exercise, even though it's just counting to 10, is that if you've got a group of people in a cast, this is a real way at the start of rehearsal to get everyone kind of in tune with each other and really kind of paying attention to each other, even without language, right? To just kind of be there together and to listen to one another. I think it's just a great way to kind of build concentration in the classroom. Again, it's not going to work with every group of students. But in terms of a theater-specific exercise that's, about theater and about doing drama, and I think you can do this with even non-dramatic texts, which I think was part of the question, is to get some students on their feet, and even if it's only 2 students who have to do the reading, get everyone else on their feet as well. And it works particularly well if there's a text where there's some kind of conflict or disagreement or argument, and it can be even a piece of nonfiction if there's an argument being made in the text, to have someone reading it, or hopefully there's kind of 2 parts and 2 people reading it. And everyone in the class has to go either on one side of the room or the other based on who they agree with at that particular moment, right? And so you can actually see the kind of you can visualize the give and take of this particular exchange. Now, it's specific to drama. You could try it with something else. But if you have a scene where there's 2 characters, it works great with something like The Crucible. Or you have 2 characters who are arguing about something or disagreeing, or one's trying to convince the other. All the audience members get to decide where they're going to be, and they can move backwards and forwards based on the kind of arguments that are being made. And it's a way to get kind of everyone involved and to really think through kind of like what's at stake in a given conversation. It's not just about those 2 characters. It's also about what does the audience think? What does the audience feel at any given moment? And that can be a lot of fun, even if not everyone is actually acting. They're all kind of up on their feet in some way.
Yeah, and I think in another way, it just sort of loosens up the students so they start feeling like they want to get involved a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for teachers who like to kind of bring in outside filmed versions of different, plays, would there be some other examples besides those really canonical texts that you might recommend that they could kind of bring in that are filmed versions that would be really effective in the classroom?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, films are tricky because film is such a different thing than actual theater. So you want to make clear that, if you're watching like the film version of Fences with Denzel Washington, it's not the same as watching him do it on Broadway. And there are actually a lot of resources now that can actually give you filmed stage productions. There's one called Broadway HD, where you can actually watch on your computer screen actual filmed versions of Broadway plays. There's another, of course I'm forgetting the name right now. There's one in England that's well known. I'll try to remember it and then post it on get the Humanities Texas people to post it on the Google Doc. But there's a British version of the same thing, where it's a bunch of national theater productions. And then you can also always check the YouTube pages of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, and the National Theatre, because especially with the pandemic, they're making a lot of their old film productions available for free online, sometimes for a limited period of time. But just check their YouTube channels to see what's going on. These are just kind of some general resources. But in terms of specific film versions of plays, I'm sorry I keep going back to this, but it's such a great example. Fences has that great version with Denzel Washington, and most of the students will recognize Denzel Washington, and so that gives them a certain kind of buy-in. There are some great Shakespeare adaptations, of course. Kenneth Branagh in the 90s did a bunch of very famous ones. And then there's a Midsummer Night's Dream movie from the 90s. I'm not necessarily huge fans of either of those. There's a really interesting Hamlet production that's available for free online on YouTube by a director named Peter Brook, who did a multicultural Hamlet back in, I think it was around 2000 or 2001, where the actor playing Hamlet is British, but he's of Caribbean descent and of African descent. And then the actress playing Ophelia is from India, and the actor playing Claudius is from Sri Lanka. And it's a really kind of beautiful version of the play. It's tricky for high school students only insofar as they make a lot of changes and they actually move certain scenes around. So it can be a little confusing if you've just read the play and then you read, you're like, wait, I thought that scene went in a different order. But it's a beautiful version of the play, and to see a truly multicultural cast tackling that play can also be very inspiring for students. I'll try to think of a few other kind of really good film examples and have the Humanities Texas folks posted in the Google Doc, in the Google Classroom as well, in terms of specifics.
We can definitely do that. So we have time for one last question, and so we're just going to go for the most voted for that we haven't gotten to yet. A question about reading the play in class or outside of class. Apparently, there's a lot of debate between which is better. So I'm assuming reading the play prior to arriving or reading the play
Right.
together when you're in the
Yeah.
classroom. Do you have a preference?
It depends on how much time you have on the syllabus, right? In the curriculum, like, do you have the time to do it together in class? If you do, I'm in favor of reading it together in class. I don't necessarily do this in college classrooms because we're not meeting every day. It's this different kind of scenario. But even then, I will very much, the students will have read it before, but I'll make sure we spend time in class reading the play out loud together. Because unlike a novel or a poem, a play is meant to have multiple voices, right? And you just can't get that when you're reading on its own. Even if you're not having the students stand up and try to do some of it on their feet, just having different voices read the play can give you a much richer sense of what's actually going on. And that you start to identify a person and a voice with a certain character. You start to get an approximation of that when you're reading it in class. So I am a big fan of reading in class together, even if you've already assigned it, right? Even if they've already done the reading on their own, still I would recommend trying to take at least a little bit of class time and pick a scene or part of a scene and have people actually read it. And it can make, they're not actors, right? But it can still make a huge difference in understanding that play as a play.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That was incredibly informative and helpful.